Damit genug der Einleitung und ich möchte gerne den ersten Speaker vorstellen. Bart Witte ist sicher einigen von Ihnen bekannt, weil er doch medial sehr viel unterwegs ist. Jeder, der irgendwo auf den Social Media unterwegs ist, stolpert zwangsläufig, beinahe täglich gefühlt über Beiträge von ihm. Er ist ein Experte für so digitale Transformation im Gesundheitswesen in Europa. Und er ist ganz sicher auch einer der progressivsten Vordenker, was diese ganze Infrastruktur angeht. Und wie das eben so ist mit Vordenkern, die sind wirklich anstrengend. Das heißt, man muss sich auf diese Gedanken einlassen, man muss ihnen zuhören, man muss denken, nee, wie kommt der auf solche Ideen? Aber es ist sehr, finde ich, anregend und ich finde es großartig, dass er seine Ideen, seine Visionen mit uns teilt. Und umgekehrt, denke ich, ist es auch extrem wichtig, dass man solche visionären Leute dass man ihnen zuhört, dass man ihnen eine Bühne bietet und deshalb freut es mich umso mehr, dass wir die Möglichkeit haben und du da tatsächlich zugesagt hast. Dass er ein Vordenker ist in Sachen künstlicher Intelligenz, lässt sich wahrscheinlich am besten festmachen, dass er schon 1989, ich behaupte mal, da waren einige wenige hier noch nicht mal geboren, er sich schon Gedanken gemacht hat in seiner Abiturarbeit zum Thema künstliche Intelligenz. Das ist wirklich eine sehr frühe Publikation in deiner endlos langen Liste, aber 1989 ist echt ein Datum, dachte ich, das muss ich benennen. Was aktuell, denke ich, dein größtes Projekt ist und worüber du sicher auch sprechen wirst, ist diese Hippo AI Foundation mit Sitz in Berlin. Das ist eine Non-Profit-Organisation, die du gegründet hast und die sich zum Ziel gemacht hat, künstliche Intelligenz in der Medizin zu einem Gemeinschaftsgut zu machen und damit eigentlich die Grundlage zu legen für eine nachhaltige und gerechte Gesellschaft, Gesundheitsversorgung in der Gesellschaft. Ich glaube, dieses Ziel, diese Daten, diese Algorithmen, um die es da geht, zu einem Gemeinschaftsgut zu machen, ist gar nicht so selbstverständlich. Wir haben gerade schon nach 30 Sekunden eigentlich eine Diskussion gehabt, die schon als Panel-Diskussion ausgereicht hätte, weil es genau darum ging, dass die anderen die Daten austauschen und dass man natürlich Zugang hat zu diesen ganzen Dingen, ist ja völlig klar, dass man das möchte. Und in dem Moment, wo es zum Beispiel um eigene Algorithmen geht, sagt man, ja, naja, von was sollte dann mein Unternehmen oder meine Forschungsgruppe leben? Und ich glaube, dass wir uns da ganz langsam in diese Richtung bewegen, aber es ist mitnichten für jeden sozusagen eine persönliche Überzeugung, dass das ein gangbarer Weg ist oder gibt es 1000 Ideen, die man da zumindest mal diskutieren muss und dann auch eigene Lösungen dafür finden sollte. Dementsprechend freue ich mich auf einen High-Level-Einstieg zu diesem Thema. Das ist wirklich sehr High-Level und auf den Vortrag von dir, Bart, Creating a more sustainable and equitable society through data solidarity and open source collaboration. Please, the stage is yours.
Before, but I was never in the basement. But it feels a bit. I had a 20-year career in big tech. I was working for SAP and then for IBM, mostly at the end for strategy. And it feels a bit like my life now, because going to the basement is asking ourselves a bit, asking the really tough questions and starting bottom up to perhaps rebuild the way how we build digital societies. We all know that in social media and platform economies, we have quite some challenges. Some of these systems look more feudal systems instead of democratic systems. And our societies are rapidly changing to the impact of how we have designed these systems. And I think there is nothing more important for me as in healthcare that we design these systems in such a way that we maximize the impact and the benefits for society, but as well for the industry. So I became somebody who is against the industry. My biggest worry is that what this artist from Japan, Roy Akedi, has always expressed is that when we digitize, we don't digitize in such a way that everybody can profit from this, as is visible in this image. I'm going to take you today through a journey that describes a bit my last 3 years of deep thinking and trying to find solutions on how I try to solve the issue of increasing information asymmetries and privatization of life-saving knowledge. And I will start, I don't know if this is, okay. I will start with Armin Azehi, professor in social theory from the LMU in Munich. I don't know if anybody read his book called Muster. It's in German. I can really recommend it because it gives you a bit of a different perspective on what digitalization is about. And he simplified it in in a way that helped me to better understand how we can look at these systems. And he called it digitalization, nothing else is the duplication of the world through data. And we mostly digitize in a very narrow focus, and we try to solve a problem. So when we look at Tesla, for example, which is very controversial, they're building the AI system for autonomous driving, and they are duplicating the world through data, so are duplicating the real existing world, but are creating these edge cases where suddenly an elephant walks on the street, so in case if this happens, that the AI reacts in such a way. So they're duplicating the world through data to solve the problem of autonomous driving. We all know this virus that has kept us busy for the last 3 years. Duplication and simulation is nothing new. In medical or sciences, we have been simulating models for understanding or better understanding diseases, and the more compute power, the more data we have, the better we can do this and the more complex. And we perhaps move away from a cellular to an organ level so we can start to better understand how certain therapies react on certain diseases. This is from Siemens Healthineers that creates duplications of the world through data by visualizing, for example, the function of a heart prior to surgery. So the surgeon, when he wants to do a heart valve replacement, understands the autonomy and understands better the heart that he's trying or is going to treat. The duplication of the world through data also happens in biology. For example, there was a company called DeepMind who created AlphaFold, who solved a 50-year-old research challenge by predicting the folding structures of proteins, and they duplicated the whole human proteome, which is 37,250 proteins, defined in a database which are under open source license. So a duplication of biology through data. But I'm going to show you another form of duplication, because when we talk about data, it sounds also abstract. It's like having a form where you have to register for the symposium, and you enter your birthday and your date, and you think, well, that's data. But this example comes from South Korea, and it's also a duplication of the world through data. And the problem they are solving here is a mother that didn't have the chance to say goodbye to her daughter who died in a car accident. And what did they do is they took all the data, the images, the videos, the voice of that deceased child, and they recreated the child in a virtual reality, and they broadcasted this on television, which of course creates a lot of interest. And I'm going to show you, and I hope the sound is coming, this sequence.
어딨어?
엄마 어디 있었어?
엄마 항상
엄마 내 생각했어?
맨날 해.
나는 엄마 많이 보고 싶었어.
엄마도 너 보고 싶었어. 우리 나연이 나연아.
I stop here. Data and duplication can be something very real, and this is a real human that died that was reproduced through just a duplication of the world through data for saying her last goodbye. Every time I see this, I have seen this video now for 60 times, I get emotional, and it makes me feel that data is just not data, especially when we apply complex models that allow us to reproduce humans. And as we know, there was this person called Zuckerberg who was not really keen on having or allowing us to own our data. He is now very hungry to create his version of the metaverse, which is a closed environment where we start to duplicate the whole bodies, the biometry, the way how we talk, move, speak, so we can become players in his virtual world. Which is for him quite challenging because he doesn't have that trust anymore to allow him to design these worlds. I really, truly find these fascinating technologies, but I question the business model and ownerships and the rights we have in these new, more kind of less feudal worlds that are digitized. And it makes me, and one of the authors and scholars that influenced me is Florido from Oxford, a philosopher. it made me think that if this is the case, and looking at that Korean example, that we humans are not only a biological entity itself. Our own self is not a biological self, but it's an informational self. Like our identities and the way what we are is not only that what I am here in my flesh and blood, we are becoming something that lives in symbiosis with our informational self. And there is interaction between both of these worlds. And the more we start interacting and looking at Generation Z that answered in a first survey beginning of this year, the more we start feeling ourselves in these worlds that are completely virtual. And Generation Z, when they were asked, where do you feel better, in the off or online or more like yourself, then the Generation Z answered, most of them, I feel more myself in this online environment. And if you then think, what is the online environment? Well, that is the TikTok world, that is the platforms where you hardly have any rights. And then we need to ask ourselves the question, when we duplicate our world through data, as Amin Azei said, what kind of duplication do we need? Because it's not only data we have to duplicate norms, we have to duplicate values, and we have to duplicate principles. Otherwise, we end up in a world that more or less looks like the medieval feudal system, where you don't have any rights, and we replace our rights with terms and conditions that are mostly serving something else. And coming now to healthcare, if we now think this, how we duplicate our healthcare systems through digitalization, I don't see much difference between what we are doing in Europe and what is happening in the US. But if you look at the norms, values, and principles of our healthcare systems, we know that we have very different systems. Our principles is, for example, our main principle in Europe is solidarity, which is a huge principle that goes also in the contract of Maastricht, but it didn't end up in the healthcare system in the US. The US has a purely market-driven system that led to the fact that they are now contributing or using 20% of their GDP for healthcare, and where the top 1% lives 15 years or longer as the poorest people in that country. They have very different values when it comes to healthcare. So when we duplicate that world, we have to watch out with narratives we use for the future. And I watched a lot of, and I read a lot of sci-fi movies because it helped me to kind of think in the future. And there's this Netflix series called Altered Carbon. And Altered Carbon is a world 250 years in the future. You can't fly with cars. There are skyscrapers that are 2,000 meters high. We can plug out our consciousness, plug it into other bodies, and people created new business models out of it. And then in this series, I find this hospital emergency scene. So there is a person with his bleeding girlfriend flying with a car into the hospital, and then you see this hospital scene, and then he cannot access. He first needs to put her hand on a scanner, and then she's declined because she doesn't have enough credits. And I ask myself, I'm watching a series where we can plug out our conscience, plug it into another body, fly with cars, we have skyscrapers, and the narrative of inequality is so deeply embedded within that culture that in a sci-fi movie, you still are confronted with something like it. And then when you later look at when you later look at the surgery, there are hardly any people involved. And it's like, well, what is the difference between a flying car and a surgeon robot that does these things? It's data, algorithms. Why is it not accessible? Why is not everybody equally having access? Why is it still something that is designed for inequality? And I think this really has to do with norms, principles, and values. And it's led me to my first thesis that I brought today. And I said, like, if we want to replicate healthcare, we really need to watch out what we are replicating. Because if we do this in a wrong way, we will transform not only digitally, but we will transform norms, values, and principles. This is my first thesis that I brought for today. Now, in AI, I'm not going to go deep into that way. AI is what's the impact of AI in healthcare? There was more qualified speakers after me that are doing really in-deep work in this area, but I try to structure them in these 10 impact areas, not 8, 10. I personally think synthetic biology is that where the future will happen of healthcare, and in R&D where the biggest impact will be. But there is one thing that we have seen is that we don't see large adoption. I was part of IBM. I was part of the strategy team that designed Watson Health. I didn't join because I had very different norms, values, and principles as my US colleagues. But one of the things that's in this paper, what is astounding, when you see at the boxes on the left side, the blue, and the crosses, the boxes on the left side, the gray ones, is when the physician has a case that it needs to diagnose and does it by itself. The blue is the assistant one, and the cross is when the AI system does it by itself in this paper. I can not judge this in detail, and you can look at it from different perspectives. It's like, oh, these AI systems are better than the physicians, but I think the main problem here is trust. If a physician don't trust the system, he will not accept or take over these decisions. And there is a lot of discussions, there's a lot of hype around AI, but if you look at the real adoption of AI in the healthcare system, even in the field of radiology, where there is so much progress, we don't see large adoption. And I think part of that has to do with trust. And I think this is strange. Something happened, but I think we need to really start understanding how we build trust. Trust is the currency for interaction. And if we don't have trust in these systems, it's like when I had a discussion with Jens, if you give data to a company, even if it's for research, what makes you interact with that company and what makes you give that data to that company? Because you want to know the long-term outcome, not only the short-term. And who benefits from it? And I brought this, I'm going to show you an example that meeting. This is created by an artist that used a new transformer model to turn a video of a ballet dancer into a cray that is dancing. So he took an existing video from a ballerina or a dancer and mixed that with the image of a cray, and it didn't took him more than 1 day to produce that. And we then can question who owns the rights of that new created artistic video. Is that the artist, the digital artist that just used an open source model, or is that the dancer that actually produced that dance and the movements and everything else? And there has been huge debates on the internet for that. The same thing is happening. Everybody probably heard of DALL-E. DALL-E is using a lot of images that are publicly scraped out of the internet and have sometimes licenses, sometimes don't have licenses. This is an example of a cover of the Cosmopolitan where you have a text prompt. There is now a new profession called text prompt engineers that are talking to AI, and they can write text and design images, but it's the AI that designed the images out of text. But it's creating a lot of discussions because you need source data, you need training data. And I tried it as well. It is really impressive because that's the question that I gave to DALL-E. Design me an image of a Porsche CEO that loves his combustion engine so much in a true climate destroyed environment. And I was really stupefied about the output that I got and the image that I gave. But the same discussions are happening in areas where AI is really taking impact. I don't know if anybody's familiar with GitHub. Well, GitHub is let's call it the Facebook for software coders that are not sharing pictures, but sharing software code. And they are having tools that people can use to contribute and optimize these codes. So it's an open source community platform that hosts a lot of libraries. You know, we had libraries in a village where we had books. Now there are libraries, digital libraries with source code. Now, that platform was bought by Microsoft. Microsoft now used all these open source libraries and trained an AI model that predicts code. So you can write text, and you don't have the ability to write code anymore, but you can predict code. And my friends who are full-stack developers, or some friends who are full-stack developers, say like, when using this AI and I program, I need 1 day a week less by using this AI system. And there are 73 million people contributing to that AI, training it. And there has been a huge fuss because Microsoft used open source code trained an AI model, but the output of it can be privatized. And that is not something what open source from an ethical perspective was about. You contribute to open source because you want the world to be having access to open knowledge. You don't want a big corporate to take that and then create value out of it that makes that new created code by the AI system something that can be proprietary. It's similar as with the images. I have then asked myself, okay, we're discussing text to image. Why are we not focusing in healthcare and we can write clinical text and then create pathology images? Like, why are we not advancing there? Because probably we don't have access to the data, but it would be quite beautiful, instead of having DALL-E and having access, that we can create such systems that allow us to create non-personalized data that we can use for training. And coming back to the question, so who profits from this, especially in healthcare? We had the same discussion 20 years ago. When I was discussing here on SAP, there was a similar, or there was another discussion going on in England and the US, because there was at that time the largest open source research project ongoing. It was called the Human Genome Project. And the Human Genome Project was a project where researchers collaborated in an open source way, and they were encoding for the first time the human genome. And what I discovered there during that time, that there was a biotech company that started to patent that genome, coded genome. And they wanted to patent the human genome in that sense. And I never thought I would give this person space, but Tony Blair and Bill Clinton were, for me, much more advanced leaders as the leadership I see today, because they decided to do this on that patent question on the human genome.
We, all of us, share a duty to ensure that the common property of the human genome is used freely for the common good of the whole human race.
He used 4 times the word common, and he made, and there was a policy that, and it was driven by an ethicist within the Human Genome Project, who actually later got the Nobel Prize for this, John Stolston. But he was able to create policies that made the human genome a common good. And then people tell me, like, if you make things open source, how are we going to earn money? Well, let's look back 20 years and now. What did it do to the economy? Well, it created, open sourcing the human genome, created a $1 trillion billion output. $1 trillion output just by open sourcing. And sometimes I have the feeling, if Gutenberg would have lived today and his investor would have been a VC, a venture capitalist of today, he probably would have advised him to say, like, let's not only patent the printing machine, but let's also patent the printing of the alphabet. So every time somebody writes a book, we have to pay licenses for each letter you write. That's kind of the level of thinking we have now. We have to capitalize everything. And I think this is absolutely wrong, because what happened if you open source and if you give open access, you cross-pollinate, you create open ecosystems that advance innovation. And the reason why human sequencing technologies have dropped down from $1 billion now to $100 is because of open access. And I think this is a lot of lessons learned. I'm coming from technology, and I think technology is truly fascinating because it's empowering people. Like, people in Africa have now a phone, and they have more access to information as probably Bill Clinton did at that time. And technology is getting cheaper. There is a phone in Africa called Maraphone, which is an iPhone 7 equivalent that is available for $58. Now, if you look at all the technologies that are relevant for the future of health, everything drops. This is amazing. But there is one thing that starts to go up, and that's the price of high-quality data. And why is that? Because people want to make it scarce in order to create economical value. So if you make things scarce, that's how you can create economical value, and that's the principle we have been living in healthcare for a long time. And if you equal then data to capital, then you just need to think what's going to happen. Then data accumulations will follow capital concentrations. And if Microsoft has 10 times the market capitalization of the GDP of Greece, then it's not a question how we're going to do it, it's just a question when it's going to happen that all the data is going to be consolidated through merger and acquisitions, to direct acquisitions of data, and we will have monopolies that create something that is scarce, which is not scarce. Data should not be scarce. So in an AI-driven platform economy, following that principle that data equals capital, data accumulations will follow capital concentrations. And this will lead to probably something we haven't seen in terms of inequalities. And we will probably create a system that is designed for inequality, because you cannot give access to all in that sense. So what we are actually doing here, and I'm using a bit the model of Jürgen Habermas here, is we're duplicating the world through data, but we're also shifting norms and values from a public sphere into a private sphere. And I try to create, using the Jürgen Habermas framework, to kind of visualize what is actually happening. So on the left side, this is where our health data is today, which is more or less a public sphere where we interchange data when we did this on paper, but then we transfer this to a private sphere where the economical value of that data is the main principle of value creation, where data capitalism is the driver of growth. Then we will shift norms, values, and principles. And in these spheres, the private sphere, there is inequality, because if you don't have access to capital, you will not get and receive access. And you can now look at it from very different perspectives, but I think, and when we looked at that South Korean example, we need to rethink this, because data is perhaps now a commodity, but I don't think it's a commodity, because that South Korean movie showed us exactly that data is not just data. So how can we do this? I think we need to redesign our systems on a principle which is based on solidarity, as I mentioned before, and not data capitalism, so we get an exchange between that private sphere and public sphere. And that means that we need to create ecosystems that are completely sharing without creating value. That means that the value extraction out of data is not economical, but it's social. And we perhaps get our sociale Marktwirtschaft in Germany, but we design digital systems that are very different as those in the US, but where we can guarantee the Article 35, which is in Europe, the fundamental right to healthcare. And I think this is possible. And I think I was a product manager at SAP, when you design a product, it's not about the ownership of the data and the model that makes the value of your product. It's about the interface. If the interface with your support, the interface with your browser or your app, that's what customers value. It's the workflow, it's the interface, that's what makes a great product. It's the brand, the design, and all these things. And I think we need to kind of redesign and shift away from the narrative that data and AI models are an economic asset that needs to be capitalized on in healthcare. I think we need to shift that, go away and move to a new value creation layer which focuses on experience. And if you miss something in healthcare, then it's really great experience and interfaces. The experience interface from healthcare, sorry for my words, but really sucks. So I said it. I recently went to a hospital for my birth for my second daughter, and I was just stupefied how set back I was into time. Does this really work? Creating value out of open source? Yes, it works. This is Open Bionics, a company that uses open source 3D printed materials to create intelligent prostheses designed by a community of 100,000 people, sharing designs, optimizing it, and they use that, created a medical product out of it, do it in a decentralized mode, and create beautiful products. And how do they earn money? Well, they have a partnership with Disney that creates a Captain America Superman arm, and you can buy add-ons that are really expensive, profitable, but everybody has access to that tool. And if you compare this to the leader, which is called Otto Bock, Otto Bock has the same kind of prostheses and sells these prostheses for a price of $60,000 to $70,000, where Open Bionics can do this for $20,000. So what does this mean? What is open source? Open source is for companies a new way to look at your R&D, to save your R&D cost, to accelerate innovation, and to build together with your patients and with your communities your products. You turn everything upside down. And if you can do this now in healthcare, we go away from that closed mindset to a very open system that probably leads again to more trust and interaction. Does this work in AI? Because people say, like, does it work? Well, it works. There was this amazing project this summer published called Bloom. Have anybody heard about Bloom? So Bloom is a project that only took 1 year. There were 1,000 volunteering research. It was a bit like the Human Genome Project that open sourced a training data set and governed 60% of a 340 billion data set, training data set. They curated 60% of the data out of 46 human languages and programming languages, trained on a French supercomputer, JZ, and they open sourced it, everything, like the governance model, everything what it did is open source and is there for replication. It killed instantly OpenAI's GPT-3, which was the competitive model. 2 weeks later, OpenAI reduced their prices by 2/3 of the original price to access that AI model because it made OpenAI's proprietary AI completely useless or invaluable. And it showed that open source collaboration really works. It doesn't always have to be a non-profit. Stability AI is a for-profit company, and they recently created and scraped a data set which is highly problematic because it's not ethically curated, because the founder says, like, I am not one to take a responsibility because there's no monopolistic moral view of this world. That is something that fits into a social, local, cultural context. And I think he is totally right. But they also published it on an open source model, and it makes really beautiful things. Like I gave in text, give me a picture of a hippopotamus flying over Mars, and it designs me these things. But the difference between DALL-E and this thing is it's open source. And this has been published 1 month ago. And in just 1 week after publication, it created a Cambrian explosion of things that I haven't seen before. New worlds, artists using these tools to design things I haven't seen that are...
Whether the weather be cold or whether the weather be hot.
We'll be together whatever.
Amazingly creative, and then if you see that somebody now takes that code and says, like, if we can do this with images, we can do this with video, and I'm going to have something that is text to video and creates completely new worlds which are based on existing videos and allows us to write scripts for movies, and these movies are being created. In 1 month's time, a huge community of 100,000 developers has had access to that, and what do we see? Innovation happening. Accessible, competitive, we see the market functioning in a way I haven't seen before. So it does work. So can we perhaps do the same and perhaps go away from text to image to text to protein function and creating these things that really truly gonna transform healthcare and do this open source? Well, some are doing this already. This is from Würzburg, Alexander Hahn, a researcher I've been working with. He created an open source AI for coloscopy. He does this. He published 300,000 images of data annotated, and they gave it away for free. The data protection office in that hospital has put a wall in front of it still, but it's not something you have to pay for. It doesn't capitalize on these things. So these open source digital systems, if we use open source licensings on data and AI models, I believe that we will see a rapid acceleration of innovation and we will move forward. And if we then do this, we can start creating value for the user on the interface level and go to what I call the experience economy. And I think this will do us good. The European Union, not going too deep in that because I've not that much time anymore, is creating 5 new acts. If you want to go deeper into that, I'm setting up the 1st and the 2nd of December and a Data and AI Summit where we're going to discuss the impact of these acts on the principle of solidarity. So we're going to deep dive into that with different panels. Does that what the European Union promise is really going to lead to an increased access? And I'm briefly jumping, what are we doing with Hippo AI? So we try to reinvent the digital system by really focusing on solidaric systems. We created new license models. We work with data donations. We have set up a data trust. We are working on a complex vision. And one of the things was, for example, can I with a big pharma, AstraZeneca joined. So can we create a system where everybody shares, where we don't have the prisoner dilemma, where somebody gives something and then the other one just receives and profits and doesn't give back, but everybody is feeling comfortable that we have a system where there's not somebody in there with his own agenda that he can contribute or get more. So we're working on different parts of this, a lot of experimental, and one part is a non-profit where we own the data, which is a common good, as Tony Blair said, and where the AI models are licensed as a common good. And the other part is a library community platform where we host this. So with this said, I'm closing my opening keynote for today. I will be at the panel discussion. I have to leave directly after that, but if you want to read more, scan the barcode. I write newsletters for free, and I share knowledge for free, and I live by my principles. Thank you so much.